Hello, attendees to this CAFII webinar. My name is Keith Martin, Co-Executive Director of CAFII, and we will begin the webinar in about 1 minute. Thank you. Hello, attendees to this CAFII webinar. My name is Keith Martin from CAFII. We're going to begin the webinar in about 30 seconds. All right, well, welcome everybody. I think we're ready to start the webinar. Good afternoon and welcome to this CAFII webinar on the future of travel and travel insurance as the world emerges from COVID-19. We are delighted to have 4 knowledgeable and authoritative panelists with us today. McAleer from the Travel and Health Insurance Association, or THIA, Joan Weir from the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association of Canada, or CLHIA, Katia Umutoniwase from Manulife, and who is the chair of the CAFII Travel Insurance Experts Working Group, and David Moorcroft, travel blogger and CAFII's media consultant. My name is Keith Martin, and I am co-executive director of the Canadian Association of Financial Institutions in Insurance, or CAFII. On behalf of myself and my co-executive director colleague, Brendan Wicks, and the CAFII Board of Directors, thank you for joining our webinar today. CAFII is a not-for-profit association dedicated to the development of an open and flexible insurance marketplace. Our 15 members include the insurance arms of Canada's major banks and credit unions, along with their insurer business partners, which underwrite credit protection insurance and travel insurance. This is the 3rd webinar offering in our 2021 series of webinars, which is focused primarily on issues related to life and health insurance policy and regulation in Canada. Now, today's webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on our CAFII website in the near future. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to our panelists during the Q&A session, for which we have allocated 10 minutes during the concluding section of today's webinar, please send them to me as the host using the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. Unless you specifically request in your question that you be identified as its source, I will pose all questions on an anonymous basis. And just before we get underway, I want to extend a special welcome to some VIP guest attendees. In addition to many representatives from our 15 CAFII member companies and from our 10 associates, which supply essential services to our association and our members, we have attendees today from allied industry associations such as the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association and the Travel Health Insurance Association, and from insurance and financial services regulators and policymakers from across Canada, including the Alberta Insurance Council, Alberta Treasury Board and Finance, Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, or CCIR, Canadian Insurance Services Regulatory Organizations, or CISRO, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, Insurance Council of Manitoba, Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority, Government of Saskatchewan, Insurance Councils of Saskatchewan, the Office of the Superintendent of Insurance, Government of Nova Scotia, the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, or BC FSA, and the Insurance Council of BC. Welcome to you all. Now let's jump right into the webinar. And I'm going to start with a question for David and Katia initially, and that is, what is revenge travel? And how prevalent is evidence of revenge travel in countries around the world? David, let's start with you.
Okay, so, revenge is something you normally take against a person, someone, but in this case, revenge is what you're taking against something, which was the pandemic, which kept us all from being able to travel. And most of us didn't realize how precious that travel was to us and how much we enjoyed it until it was taken away from us. So that's what revenge travel. I like to use a term that someone else has coined, and they call it indulgent travel, because we're going to indulge ourselves by taking more trips. We're going to spend more on those trips because we've had 18 months, for some of us, maybe 2 years of not spending that money on travel. So now we're going to make the best of it that we can, spend more, and do it more often. So that's what revenge travel is.
You're on mute.
Oop.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, we as insurers are expecting the same thing. As individual have been not allowed to travel, we have a lot of pent-up demand, and when travel recovers, as we're calling it revenge travel, as the pace of travel recovers, we will see travel insurance recover as well. For two main reasons. As we're recovering from COVID, of course, we might see some countries, some venues, some hotels, some resorts requiring proof of insurance before you can enter such locations. But as well, because of what has happened with the pandemic, we now have more consumers aware, whether they're young, mature. In the past, if you were 15, 20, you didn't think you needed insurance, but now COVID is one of those risks that doesn't care how old you are. It's a virus that you catch. So we are expecting that we will see more attachment rates. Our attachment rates will grow as people are worried about variants, even if you're vaccinated. What could be a variant in that country that I'm going to. And as David alluded to, we are actually starting to notice that as we have started recovering our travel insurance sales, we are noticing that we have a lot of large trips that are coming through that people are planning for the next 2 to 3 years, and they are definitely investing money to cover those trips and to protect themselves against the risk. So absolutely, revenge travel will have a positive impact on the industry as a whole.
Thank you, Katia. I'm going to pose the next question to Will and David. And the information just shared by Katia and David provides a nice segue into that question, which is about the unforeseen consequences of COVID-19 as travel begins to reopen around the world. So is travel revenge going to lead to supply and demand imbalances and result in significant price increases for international vacations, for flights, for cruises, for car rentals? Are we already seeing evidence of that happening? And if yes, do you think it will be a short-lived temporary phenomenon or something more long-lasting? Will, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of that question results around is, will the inventories meet the demand? So will airlines be able to put more capacity on, right? They've taken airplanes out of service. Some have taken middle seats out. We're going to see that change, but will they be able to put that back in a timely manner? And in all likelihood, it just is going to mean higher prices. So especially when we consider some of those destinations that we travel to that were safe aren't necessarily the same. So some of the options might be different. And I believe we pointed on in the early question is that the differing vaccination levels around the world, that places just aren't as safe as there were. We've also seen numerous articles speaking about car rental shortages, for crying out loud, because of the steps that some of the rental companies have taken. So there are a lot of knock-on effects that are going to impact it. But the one thing for sure is people want to get out there and travel.
Well, if I could just ask a follow-up, when you say some countries are just not as safe, you're talking more than COVID here.
Oh, more than COVID. So we've seen certainly that COVID has been a health emergency, without a doubt, catastrophic events. But the other part is it's a real economic issue. So take a look at some of these countries where we might have considered them safe before. Their economies have been simply crushed as a result of the pandemic. So I was in Bogota probably about 2 years ago now, and while dangerous, you're good, situationally aware. However, I would think twice about going down to there, or perhaps a destination like Cartagena for sun destination, we should be thinking about it. There should be information provided into insureds so they understand what some of those risks are that they're taking.
Now, how about the Caribbean, Will? Is that one of the areas that you're concerned about?
Hey, look, we've seen through some of the reports, as a matter of fact, that there are a couple of large tourist destinations, and our security teams are putting forth information that are talking particularly on the west coast of Mexico. Look, #1 Caribbean destination Canadians travel to, and increased crime rates as a result of some of the gang wars down there. But, what does that mean? It means Acapulco. It means Puerto Vallarta. Those situations are less safe than they were before. Beyond that, what are the real statistics coming out of a place like Mexico relative to COVID? What are the real vaccination rates? And what are the pressures on individuals who are working at hotels right now to go into work, whether or not they've got symptoms?
Thank you, Will. And David, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to build on some of the things Will said. So, shortages and imbalances. So one of the things Will mentioned, car rentals. So they're referring to that now in the travel industry as carpocalypse, like the apocalypse, because in some places around the world, particularly in Hawaii and Florida are the two biggest places, there have been big shortages of cars, and ones that are available, outrageous prices. So during Memorial Day weekend, you had to pay $373 per day for a car in Hawaii. In February, 18 of 20 airports in Florida were sold out of rental cars. And in the Hawaiian Islands that weekend, they were $400 to $500 per day. So, there are imbalances in certain places. Cruises. So they've been selling out. One World Cruise. Now, World Cruise is 130, 125 days. Not many people can afford them. But one weekend, one day, a World Cruise from Oceania sold out, and that's a year away. That's how much pent-up travel demand there is. I tried to book a river cruise on Friday for next April 28th from Amsterdam to Basel on the Rhine River. Full, nothing available. So it depends on where you're traveling to and when you're traveling. Right now, the big crunch is in your own domestic area. People have not been planning to travel outside of their own state in the US or out of their own province in Canada, but they are looking at international travel further out. And as we get more and more countries relaxing the rules on who can get in and what conditions there are, you're going to see more of that. And will it last for too long? I think it's going to last for a few years because there's a lot of pent-up demand.
Thanks very much, David. Next question is for Joan and Will. What approaches are different countries and regions taking around the world to reopening their borders to international travelers? And how does Canada stack up in that regard? Joan?
I'll start off here by looking at different approaches around the world. Well, we are seeing a multitude of approaches, really, including the Australia approach, which is not opening at all until 2022, to forming bubbles or corridors, such as the European Union or Australia and New Zealand originally did. I think what countries have learned over time is that they have to rely on their own data in decision-making with respect to cases, hospitalizations, all of that, and not necessarily partner with other countries. Corridors and bubbles around the world, they rose and they fell quickly with the arrival of the variants. The one thing that bodes well for Europe, I would say, is that they were quick off the mark to develop a vaccine passport for travelers. And that should encourage tourism and a two-track system whereby the fully vaccinated do not need to quarantine. Testing measures still in place. In Canada, I would have said a few weeks ago that there was very little discussion between the US and Canada regarding opening the borders. Of course, that's changed. We first learned about the announcement of the Stanley Cup being able to be played in both countries. That was a pleasant surprise. And then today we heard that indeed the vaccinated travelers would not need to quarantine upon return home and would not be subject to the hospitals or to the hotels. Again, a great surprise. What we as Canadians, I think, need to see is a reopening plan. Those are good first steps, but we need to understand the reopening plans, both for the provinces as for the border with the US. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't say that talking about reopening with global affairs to different countries, I think that's a step down the road a bit. But again, we need to really understand the factors that they're looking at in other countries in order to understand how they're going to reopen international travel.
Excellent. Thank you. Will?
Yeah, Joan, great points that you've made. I think beyond vaccination passports that have been talked or broadly, proof that you've been vaccinated. The other thing that we're starting to see, and this is where the governments are really going to need to be clear for our travelers, is that what is considered not only adequate proof, and I think we're starting to get a good handle on that, but what vaccination will be accepted. We've had situations with global travelers being turned away from the United States because their vaccination was not in line with their expectation at the border. So for instance, not only were there individuals who had received an mRNA vaccine, but also supplemented with a second dose of AstraZeneca. And AstraZeneca, not yet approved in the United States, so they were not accepting it. So really what it does is not only create a lot of concern or possible concern amongst traveling Canadians who perhaps have chosen AstraZeneca or perhaps a dual type of a dose, is what happens when we're traveling further afield? So what happens when we're traveling maybe to Russia or perhaps to China, where they have their own vaccines? And we've heard stories about these types of vaccine diplomacy, where individual nation states are pushing out their own vaccine over others. Will they accept the others that have proof behind them and where you're vaccinated with a different dose? So certainly more stuff to consider, and all the more reason to make sure you've got help a phone call away through your travel insurance policies.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Let me ask the next question to David and Katia. Will a vaccination passport or some form of proof of vaccination be a must to be able to travel internationally? And where is Canada likely to line up on that, both in terms of substance and timing? David?
Okay, so I think one of the issues we've had is the term vaccine passports. It's caused a lot of problems, especially with people who are concerned about the connotation of a passport. Really, all it is a vaccine certificate. We've had them since 1935. The World Health Organization, yellow card. You need to be vaccinated to visit certain countries, usually yellow fever. When I went to school as a kid, I think they still have it. I had to have a card showing the vaccinations I had against polio and a bunch of other things to get into school. So the concept of having some kind of proof of vaccination is not new, and it's quite common. So people have been getting concerned because of the name. Do we need it? Absolutely. If we want to open up more countries to travel sooner, being fully vaccinated is going to make it safer for everyone. In fact, at least 25 countries in Europe have said they're going to reopen their borders to people who are fully vaccinated. Other countries are doing the same, and it just makes travel safer. There are some issues. I mean, in Florida, the governor of Texas have said they're not going to allow proof of vaccination. This is creating problems for the cruise industry. Royal Caribbean has said they will obey that rule, will not require proof. They have to go through some CDC protocols of test cruises in order to be able to do that. Other cruises have said they're not ready for that yet. They haven't made that decision. They may cruise out of Bahamas instead. But most countries are thinking that it's a good thing to do. Canada, we still have a bit of an issue, although I noticed that Manitoba has said they're going to provide proof, digital proof of vaccination that can be used internationally. So if Canada doesn't do it, I think the provinces will likely go ahead and do it. Some of the states in the US have done it. The New York State has the Excelsior Pass, a digital proof of vaccination. So if countries don't do it, there will be other people. And people have said in Europe that they may even allow their vaccine certificate proof be used by other countries. In other words, you can download your proof onto their digital system. So yeah, I think it's here, and I think we're going to have it for a few years.
Thanks, David. Katia, what are your thoughts on a vaccination passport?
Yeah, exactly. So coming at it from a risk perspective, I mean, it's clear that once a person is vaccinated, whether it's your first dose, you already had your second dose, the risk really diminishes. The rate of infection, or even how quickly you can recover from COVID if you were to catch it. So insurers would be we've been looking at ways to differentiate the level of benefits between vaccinated and non-vaccinated individuals. So when you talk about different benefits provided to different individuals, of course, a vaccine certificate of some sort is going to be necessary because that's the only way you can prove that you're part of that risk category versus that risk category. The other interesting thing, though, as we're talking about vaccine certificates and passports, is the challenge that it might pose from a logistics perspective. So we've talked about how, as we reopen, different governments would have maybe different requirements. So imagine you're on a leg where you have to have 3 legs. So you go from Canada, you transit to Asia, you transit all the way, you go to Africa. Each one of those locations, each one of those countries could have different requirements as far as vaccine certificate, even within any given country. So you enter a country, maybe all you need is 1 dose. And maybe you get to a resort, you have a different requirement. So logistically speaking, it will be interesting to see how that plays out because we will have to manage different trip interruption risks based on where the person is traveling, where they're at in their journey, and how the different venues, the different events that they wanted to go to whilst on their trip have really tackled safety as far as COVID. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, exactly. To echo David, it will be important to be able to show who's vaccinated, who's not, just for the purpose of being able to manage the risk and allow travel.
All right, thank you, Katia. And I want to remind attendees that you can pose questions using the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. And on that subject, we have a very interesting question that is on this very topic. So I'm going to pose it right now and invite any panelists to jump in on this issue. So let me read the question. Thinking about vaccine passports, doesn't this amplify the disparities between have and have-nots? In other words, the vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Aren't we really talking about vaccines for the Western Northern world? What about those countries and people that don't yet have access to vaccines? So question is asking about whether this will perpetuate some inequities, this move down passport vaccines. So could any of you want to jump in on comment on that?
Sure, I'll go first. Of course, there are going to be inequities. There are going to be inequities if vaccine passports are used for more than just travel, which some countries may decide to do. But once again, we've been doing this since 1935. This is nothing new. And if people want to travel to some places in the world, they need to prove they're vaccinated for certain things. It's not necessarily 100% equal or fair, but it is the safest way to allow travel sooner. And I mean by several years sooner than if we don't have some kind of proof requirement for either vaccination or COVID tests, or both.
Anybody else want to jump in on this? Will?
Ultimately, it's not going to be any individual country, like for instance, Canada. It's not going to be up to us to say yay or nay for vaccination passport. It's going to be those destinations that Canadians want to, or in some cases, for business purposes, need to travel to. And making sure that those economies are kept safe from their standpoint, they're going to require us to show proof. And we'd better find some solutions that will work and that will be legitimate.
And on this topic, I just want to talk about something related. Joan, I'm going to pose this to you. I know that there's been some social media falsehoods spread around how if you get a COVID test or you get a vaccination, it could impact your ability to make a claim for life insurance. And I know CLHI has done some good work to try to counter these falsehoods and myths. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, for sure I can. We actually do have
Joan, we're having a little trouble hearing you. Maybe if you could just get a little closer to your mic.
Yeah, sorry about that. For sure, it's been difficult. There have been myths over time. first myth was that if I catch COVID, that will be a reason for declining my life claim if I die. And of course, the two aren't connected at all. And then the second one, which happens to be around now, is more around vaccines. If I do take a vaccine and I perhaps die, then my life insurance won't pay out. Well, again, there's no connection between the two. So we have spent some time trying to dispel myths around that.
Thanks, Joan. And given that we just had this question about inequities, I'm going to skip to a question that's on that subject for Will and Joan. And that is, what do you see the impact of the pandemic being on travel to lesser developed countries, which rely heavily on tourism and which are having a much slower vaccination rollout than the G7 countries? Will, you want to start us off on that question?
Well, look, some of the countries that Canadians like to travel to are doing okay, right? Some of the spots in the Caribbean, we've seen really good vaccination rates. With others, it may just be that we have to wait a little bit longer, right? The reality is that we've certainly seen the inequities between countries and between regions, and if it's not going to be safe, that's something that each individual will need to make their own personal risk decision on once the government starts to address the advisories accordingly as well. And insurance plays a part in that. Understanding what your insurance coverage may be to various regions, depending upon the level of the advisory put out by the Canadian government.
Joan, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just don't disagree. I would just add that we cannot forget really that Canadians live around the world. We're in every country in the world. And back last spring when Global Affairs Lab, March 2020, when their message was, it's now time for you to come home, Canadians. Many did. You can remember all the flights that came back with Canadians from India, Pakistan, Portugal, Peru, all kinds. And those Canadians who have roots in other countries will probably want to, and many of those are less developed countries and probably have the slower vaccine rollouts. They're going to want to travel as soon as they can to see their relatives and to potentially move back to that country. But I would just agree with Will that it's going to be up to them, their risk tolerance.
Joan, let me ask a follow-up question. This is a question from the audience, actually. I know you can't completely answer this because it's a government decision, so we're really asking you for your thoughts or views. And the question is, will travel advisories be issued for countries that have low vaccination rates? What are your thoughts on that, Joan?
Well, the way it works in government is that, well, Global Affairs does issue the advisory. It is Public Health Affairs Canada that sets the medical clinical criteria. So would PHAC do that? It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. I guess, in my opinion, I expect that they would not. You remember that the government declined really to define essential travel, rather leaving it up to travelers to define that. So my impression is they probably would not.
All right, thank you, Joan. David, Will, I know you're both avid travelers. You've seen many parts of the world and want to get back at doing that again. I want to ask you, has the COVID-19 pandemic and its ongoing impacts produced the end of the international travel bucket list as we've come to know it for retirees and others with the time and means to pursue such a list? David, why don't you start us off on that?
Sure, I say it's exactly the opposite. From what I've been reading, people are now, when they feel safe to travel, will accelerate doing their bucket list because these are places they've always dreamed about doing. Now they've had 18 months where they couldn't go anywhere. Who knows when something else could happen, especially as they get older with their health. So what I'm reading says people are going to double down on doing their bucket list. They're going to get things done sooner than later. All the research shows that this indulgent travel, people are spending 2 or 3 times more next year on their vacation than they would have in the past because they've saved up for 1 or 2 years of non-travel. So people are going to be spending more. They're going to be doing more exotic trips. They're going to be staying longer, and they're going to be going to places that are on their bucket list and always wanted to go to.
Yeah, I think that bucket is getting more and more full. I think I've even come up with a few more to add to that list. Just listening to David talk about all of the cruises and different places he's trying to book. But no, I think that's absolutely happening. I know personally, I've already made 2 bookings, one of which is in this year already. Serious bucket list off my list. And I know I've got many more for business that are queuing up. So things are changing fast, and it's a pretty dynamic and an interesting spot we're in terms of the travel insurance industry as we sit today.
All right, thank you. The next question is going to be a little different because it's going to be based on poll results. So I'm going to launch a poll right now, and I'm going to ask attendees to answer the question. So the question is, 5 years from now, will the level of the cruise holidaying business be stronger than, weaker than, or about the same as it was pre-pandemic? So please answer the poll, and we'll then have the panelists comment on it. So we'll give you just a few more seconds. Now I'm going to pose the question prior to our publishing the poll to our panelists. So David, Katia, from 5 years from now, will the level of the cruise holidaying business be stronger than, weaker than, or about the same as it was pre-pandemic? I'm going to end the poll now, and I'm going to share the results. So do you see those results?
Yeah, I see them. I'm going to disagree with them.
Go for it, David.
I'm going to say it's going to be stronger, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons. One, up until the pandemic, cruising was the fastest growing form of travel in the world for about the last 25 years, growing at an incredible yearly rate. Number two, there are a lot of ships on order that have to be filled. So it may affect pricing, supply and demand. So there may be better deals 5 years from now, but they have to fill those cabins. So there's going to be more inventory available, which suggests, more people cruising. I think the real issue here is, okay, we all know that cruising has been great for older people, whether it's 40 and up or 35 and up or 60 and up, depending on the type of cruise line and what they specialize in. So what are the millennials going to do? Because they're a different mindset when it comes to travel. They like more experiential travel. They like to, be out there in the wild and see things and be adventurous. So that's why you've seen tremendous growth in a form of cruising called adventure cruising. These are small ships that go to out of the way remote places, and you can see things that many times you can only get to by water. Whether it's Antarctica, whether it's the Arctic, whether it's the Norwegian fjords, whether it's the Kimberley coast of Australia, all of these places now millennials are flocking to. And now the fastest growing segment of the cruise industry is the adventure travel cruising segment. So that's why I think 5 years from now, there will be more people cruising.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Katia?
Yep, I concur with David, and we're seeing that too in the trends. And the other thing too that is the reason why I think David is right is because when you look at the current measures for COVID that are in place, the vaccinations, the proof of vaccination, what cruise lines are doing, like they are leading the way in ensuring the safety of the travelers, because as we've seen, because of COVID and the nature and how it's transmitted, the cruise lines have been the hardest hit. And they are leading the way in making sure that passengers feel safe, that they have measures in place to ensure that the rate of transmission is low. And from an insurance perspective and from a risk perspective, as we see those changes they're making, and as we see the level of government advisories being reduced to allow for more cruising, we will be able to cover more cruisers. So I do agree it will take off. Personally, I've not taken a cruise yet, but for the first time in my life, I'm saying, oh, that's something I want to knock off my bucket list. So I definitely agree that cruising will be popular. And David has alluded to it, sold out right now. So.
Great, thank you. Joan, question for you. what do you foresee in terms of the lasting impact of COVID-19 on large group tourism, including school tours for both domestic and international trips?
Thanks for that. Yes, large group tourism for schools and for seniors has really been a staple of the past. And what we saw evolve due to the pandemic was the fact that these tour operators were getting refunds in some cases back from prepayments made to hotels, say, or to transportation, and not being fully transparent with their customers, so the students or the seniors, as to exactly what was coming back in. And that was really difficult for students and seniors. They weren't getting money back. They didn't understand why. There was a trip cancellation, I'm sure, involved as well. And students were out of money when they really needed it to return to them so they could pursue their post-secondary education. So given these issues that resulted in class action lawsuits, I suspect that schools and school boards, primarily them, will be very hesitant to wade back into offering school tours. Not only would it be fraught with risk for them, but then the school would have to figure out, vaccination. They'd have to figure out what the requirements of that country were. They'd have to make sure the students had those requirements. So it would all be very complicated. So I would think not for this fall, maybe not even for the next fall, but over time they'll get past that. But certainly it's not rushing back to large group tours.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Joan. Will, David, as vaccinations cause the threat from COVID-19 to recede and travel starts to open up, what's your view on whether local and domestic tourism will see a net benefit? And how long lasting will that benefit be? Will, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Some of the things that we're seeing is that, hey, great time to travel within Canada anyway this summer, and the intentions are definitely focused on domestic. Well, we believe a lot of that is driven by the wait for the second dose, and most likely demand for international travel. First of all, it's real, and we'll likely see significant increases come this fall and certainly into the winter. In fact, some of the recent survey results that we've seen are showing a change in what was viewed to be Canadians saying, hey, maybe we want to travel a little bit less to the US, and significantly increased, in fact, reversed that little bit of a trend at the beginning of the pandemic to wanting to go to the US and wanting to go to the US first.
I'll add this. I would say short term, Canada is going to do very well. Try and book a cottage in Ontario this summer. It's impossible unless you want to pay $800 a night to stay in a bus or a travel trailer. So, people have made that decision. That's the safest place to be right now. But once it starts to open, people are going to want to go back and do the travel they have wanted to do in the past. A survey in the States said that 70% of Americans plan to travel out of state next year. So, out of state, not out of country. Americans tend to travel in country. I think Canada's going to lose on the West Coast because of what they did with Alaska cruising. The Canadian government banned cruising until February of 22. What happens in cruising up until the Senate and Congress passed a temporary law was you had cabotage. The Jones Act back in the 19th century prohibited cruise ships that were not American built and American, sailed, manned, from going to two American ports without having a foreign port in between. So that's why so many cruises left from Vancouver, or if they left from Seattle, had to stop somewhere in British Columbia. So when Canada decided it wouldn't open up, the Americans decided to suspend the Jones Act, cabotage, for this summer's Alaska sailing season. They went to Canada and said, look, would you just let our ships stop in a Canadian port and not let anyone off, just so we wouldn't need to amend this act? Canada, in my opinion, foolishly said no. That would have been an ideal solution. No risk to Canada because people weren't getting off the ship, and yet they wouldn't have had to amend the Jones Act, which means we maintain return to that next year. Now, if the US keeps that amendment in place next year, there's going to be tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars lost to Canadian tourism in British Columbia because of ships not coming to Canada. So there's a big danger there. So I think short term, we're going to do well with domestic travel. Next year, the year after, I'm not quite sure. And I'm particularly concerned about BC and the cruise industry there.
David, what's the rationale behind this US law?
Well, it's because they wanted shipping companies to use US made ships, because back then it was important. There were big shipbuilding industries in all of the major industrial countries, and they competed with each other. And it was also a big source of employment. So you wanted your own sailors, your own mariners to have jobs. So it was brought in for that purpose. But all the cruise lines are owned by foreign companies. The companies are headquartered, the ships anyway, are registered in Panama and in Monrovia and the Marshall Islands. So they don't qualify.
Okay, thank you for that, David. I've got a couple of questions now that are going to focus on the insurance industry panelists, Joan, Will, and Katia. But David, jump in if you have a perspective you want to add. And these questions are really about travel insurance products. So let me begin with the question on what have travel insurers and their distributor partners learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that will have a material and lasting impact upon travel, health, medical insurance? And what improvements or changes have been made or are likely to be made to the product and to its distribution? Who would like to start us off?
Yeah, I can start off.
Katia?
The first thing that we learned was not necessarily the coverage itself, is how prepared we were as insurers to handle this level of risk, this amount of claimants, and the variations and the changes, because every time you turn around, a government would have imposed a new restriction, a country would have changed something, airlines were stopped. So really, we have learned that we needed to be prepared and prepared. The other thing that we've learned as well was the importance of technology. So when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of reliance on person-to-person interaction. Basically learning that the more you are digitized in your operations, the better you are off as far as handling the needs of your clients when it comes to an event similar to COVID. Another thing that was critical was communication. There was not a day where something wasn't changing that you had to educate not only your partners, but you also had to educate consumers as to what level of coverage. And really what that has resulted into was the emphasis on the need to really make coverage policies and contracts even more plain language, so that a person who chooses to purchase travel insurance really truly understands what they're covered for in the event of a normal risk, like you fall and you break a leg, versus when something like a pandemic happens, because it's really critical. As more people are looking to attach travel insurance, they will be looking to understand the coverage. Is my coverage the same if I'm flying versus when I'm boarding a cruise ship? How does a consumer understand the difference? Is my coverage the same when I'm vaccinated versus when I'm not? So really the importance of understanding the coverage is one of the top learnings from this experience. And the other thing, I mean, I'm not going to say it was a surprise, because governments have always had levels of advisories that somehow impacted how travelers behave. But I mean, this was on a whole new level. The impact that governments have on influencing the travel industry, and as a result, really travel insurance in general. So yeah, lots of learnings, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out in the future as things evolve.
Thank you, Katia. Joan, you want to jump in?
Yes, I do. I just want to build on what Katia has said, because all of her points are very, very valid. Besides the digitization, I think this movement to virtual healthcare that has happened in every country in the world will really benefit travelers as well. I think that's a key piece of it. And then I would just like to say that service apps, so apps that travel insurers will make available, and did before pandemic, some of them, where your trip has been delayed, your flight has been delayed, and a pass for the lounge comes out to you. Those kinds of apps, I think, are going to really ensure that insurers give their customers peace of mind.
Thank you, Joan. Will?
Yeah, I'd echo what both Joan and Katia have said. I'd say coverage certainty, right? We knew that was an issue, supported by the work we've done with our great regulators in this country. So making sure that coverage certainty is there. So according to research that Thea just gotten back, in terms of Canadians' willingness to travel, we know that 55% of Canadians are more likely to travel if they can have that coverage certainty, and 74% are now more likely to review their travel insurance policy before they travel. So yeah, we can look at some, as an industry, some silver linings to this, because I think the messaging has always been, look, please read and understand your policies. And of course, we'll do our best to make sure that they are clear and articulate. And I think one of the things that we also were able to do quite clearly was to make sure that as this evolved, we came out as an industry with new types of coverage to cover the needs, because we knew people were still going to travel, whether or not there was an advisory up or not. But to see the industry respond with programs that will provide that safety net for them when they travel, because let's face it, if you're traveling without this type of program, we all know, and we just need more of the Canadians to know, is that the government isn't going to be there. You need to make sure that you've got the help that you need, so your plans get rerouted and now you're stuck somewhere, or worse, a medical emergency and the costly nature of that. But then beyond that, I think what we've also learned, and we're seeing that in today's webinar, thanks to CAFII, is that together with CLIA and Thea, we've come together to make sure that we're communicating more broadly. And I applaud Joan, you and Keith and Brendan for your efforts to make sure that we're doing that, because I think then we're serving our customers properly.
Thank you for that, Will. Katia, I'm going to put you on the spot as an insurer from Manulife and as chair of CAFII's Travel Insurance Experts Working Group. We have a question from the audience, and I think it's prompted by David saying that millennials are looking for experiential travel, for travel that gives them an experience that is interesting and important for them. And the question is, and I think I know the answer to this because I think it's already the case, will travel insurance costs vary by the adventurous nature or the risks taken on certain types of trips? So Katia, over to you.
It might be. We currently, I'm not sure about other insurers, but there is no differentiation based on where you're traveling to or the type of trip you're taking. But what we have learned for sure is that we need to be able to adapt to different levels of risk. As an example, one of the things that insurers might have to consider is no longer offer your standard package that covers everything, but offer coverage in ways that clients can choose the level of coverage they want. So you have your basic for the person who's just flying from Toronto to New York, is not doing anything crazy or adventurous. But then you have also to be able to package other riders or other additional benefits that you can add on for the adventurer, for the person who maybe in 2-3 years from now, COVID will no longer be top of mind as life will have come back to normal. But what if the next pandemic hits? Should we not have riders or additional coverages that people can package and add to the standard coverage to cover the different needs they have? So it's clear that we are going to have different types of travelers, and they will have different types of risks that they need to cover. So the important thing is that we as insurance companies be ready to cater to the different needs instead of trying to fit everybody in one bucket.
And Katia, just to follow up on that, is it fair to say that as a general principle, if you're doing something very risky, like parachute jumping or rock climbing without ropes, that you either have that as an exclusion or you have to pay more premium?
Exactly, you would have to, yeah. So right now, yeah, so those coverages are excluded in most policies, but yeah, if you wanted coverage specific to that, then you might have to pay a premium, for sure.
Extra premium. Okay, thank you, Katia. I'm going to ask the three of you another question related to what we've learned and what might change. And this is, along the same lines as the previous question, but it's focused on trip cancellation. And maybe you can comment, about the challenges for the travel insurance industry around what happened in trip cancellation, where airlines did cancel the trips, but did not refund them, just offered waivers. And then some individuals felt that they had a right to claim that, even though they should be ultimately getting their money back. So let me ask you if you could comment on that. Joan, I know you've been very involved at CLHI on this, so maybe I'll start with you and then go to Will and then Katia.
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion amongst Canadians who had trip cancellation and who potentially got a voucher or turned down a voucher. They didn't want it. About what trip cancellation would cover. So we did spend a lot of time just telling Canadians that because you've been offered something, which is a voucher, which represents 100% of what you paid, then there is no insurance loss. So trip cancellation doesn't come into the effect here. It did get a little bit more complicated when there were some travel funds. So Ontario has a travel fund as well as Quebec. There were some discussions. It was a very complicated situation. So when WestJet, I guess, first came out to say we're going to actually pay these back, that was great. When Air Canada did it a couple of weeks ago, and I think it expires Friday, so if you haven't gotten your money back, you do it this week. That was even better. It does raise the prospect that some Canadians may have gotten a refund through their travel insurance policy through trip cancellation, and they may get something back from the airline. But that is just a possibility that's out there. So I guess I would just
That's double dipping, isn't it, Joan?
That's what I would call it. Yes. But I would just say that that whole situation was tremendously complicated and difficult for Canadians to understand.
What are your thoughts, Will?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that those policies are reimbursement policies, and if you do have other ways to recoup, so that's on us to make sure that we continue to communicate that. But the level and scope of not just a travel advisory, but a travel advisory for every single country, right, which we have not seen, had launched into effect an unprecedented number of policies on which this industry absolutely delivered, right? And we were able to get to those individuals and pay out an unprecedented number of claims that individuals had the right for. So I think there was a lot of good news in there too, but I think certainly being clear about it. I think the other part that we need to touch upon are situations where maybe a flight wasn't canceled, but people were starting to get a little concerned in the lead up or afterwards to traveling to a particular destination, not thinking it was safe to do so, and they may have very well been correct in that, but understanding what the triggers are for an insurance policy or the covered risks that you've got in that policy, very important. So under some policies, and we've seen some innovation come in, and we'll see how that goes as we move past the pandemic for things like cancel for any reason. So individuals can just make a decision, a determination themselves to say, hey, I'm just not going. And as a result, then the policy can take place. But to suggest that coverage was there if you didn't buy that particular type of policy, there were a lot of people who were needing a little bit more clarity on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that too, I mean, traditionally you're thinking of travel insurance. Yeah, medical is the big expense. Most people, when they book the trip, they're saying, oh, I know I'm going to go. I don't need trip cancellation or interruption. But what this has taught the consumer is that you don't have as much control on your travel as you think you do, because you may want to travel, but you may be prevented from doing so for 2 years for reasons beyond your control. So I think that is going to have an impact on how people think about trip cancellation, because traditionally it was do you choose not to go or do you fall sick? But now there's a multitude of reasons, a multitude of institutions that might impact your ability to travel. So I think it's going to put the need for travel insurance at the forefront as well, whether it's from a medical or even trip cancellation perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And we do have a question from the audience that I would like to pose, and I'll invite any of you to jump in on it. For those traveling with small children who aren't yet eligible for a vaccine, how do you see this working with a vaccine passport as well as with insurance coverage? Any volunteers to take that one on?
I'll start first. I think there are some governments that are making allowances for children under a certain age. I don't know whether it's 12 or 8, but that is an issue that governments are aware of when it comes to vaccine certificates. So my advice would be to check your destination. I know cruise lines are doing the same thing. They're not requiring vaccination certificate of children below a certain age. So check with your provider of the travel or the country you're going to and see what their policy is.
Thanks, David. And Will, I think you were going to jump in on this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real concern for individuals that can't get their kids vaccinated. And I think it's also a concern even within our country, outside of travel and the return to work, right? If you go back to work and you're vaccinated, do you still take precautions because you have individuals at home who might be more at risk? The science is not particularly clear. It is believed that you can still carry as a result and thus infect others even if you're vaccinated. So the knock-on effect to travel, it's uncertain right now. And I think we got to stay tuned on this part. And that's another piece of direction that we would be looking for from the government to provide some clarity to.
Thanks, Will. And maybe I'll follow up on that with another question from the audience. And it's, do you think travelers will need to worry about staff at all-inclusive type destination resorts faking receiving a vaccine or coming to work with symptoms? What do you think about that, Will?
So yeah, good point. And in fact, I've got some stats on that because we know that of the individuals who aren't going to get vaccinated, so these are Canadians, right? So of the individuals who aren't going to get vaccinated, we know that 16% of those individuals would knowingly falsify proof of vaccination. Those are Canadians. So now let's take it to a resort destination, and you need that job. You need to provide food for your family, and you've got to go in. What is the likelihood that those individuals might try to falsify some sort of proof of vaccine at that point? We saw a cottage industry start with vaccination, not vaccination, but rather negative PCR testing about the requirement to show before you came in. There were many that even came into Canada, but we saw it all around the world. So what's going to happen as it comes to providing proof of vaccination?
Excellent, thank you. We only have a few minutes left. The panel has been wonderful and the hour has flown by. I do have a couple extra questions I want to try to squeeze in. David, I know you like tough questions, so I'm going to pose this one to you. It's slightly different from the other questions that have been asked. From an environmental and sustainability lens, how do you see the future of travel in terms of its impact on the climate crisis? Many scientists see climate change and its impact as the next pandemic.
Yeah, and I think the leaders in the travel industry are aware of that and are now taking action. Even cruise lines, some of the new ships being built are LNG powered. They're not the old diesel bunker fuel. They're building them, with liquid gas. They're building them to be more fuel efficient. They're being more careful about where they travel to. In terms of resorts, a lot of the big travel companies are engaged in carbon offset programs. Some even airlines allow you to pay, donate money to offset your own trip. So it's in its infancy, but I believe the biggest travel companies, the biggest cruise companies, the biggest hotel and resort companies, the biggest airlines have been made aware of this by their customers, and they are starting to take action. More is needed, but they're going down that path.
Thank you, David. And final question, any of the panelists can jump in on this. What are your views of the Canadian approach to the Canada-US border? What do you think should be the path that the government takes? Who'd like to jump in on that?
Hey, look, I think consumers and Canadians will speak on this. And from the time that you are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, we know that Canadians are saying they're able to make their decision. We're seeing government leaders, we've seen delegations over to G7 coming back now that may or may not be quarantined. We've seen, as the headline showed, NHL players skating around the quarantine rules. It is time for those quarantine rules to adapt to the vaccinated public's desire, and that is so that I can make my own decision once I'm vaccinated.
I agree. It's got to be a reward for being vaccinated.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in?
That's what Will
Joan,
said.
you're on mute.
No, I can't do anything other than what Will said. Will, yay, here.
Yeah, same here. There's pent-up demand. We're vaccinated. The risk is less and less. We're seeing it in numbers. Let us travel. I think that's what the majority of the population would say.
And beyond that, we know that there's a segment of the population that have said, hey, I'm not going to get vaccinated. Well, if it's a requirement of travel, we know that a decent percentage of those individuals have said they'd actually get vaccinated. So why not use it as a bit of a carrot, start to open things up, and show us what life can be like, the life that we're seeing on TV right now, south of the border.
Right on.
Thank you to each of you. David, Joan, Will, Katia, you've been a wonderful panel. I think it's been very informative, and insightful. And on behalf of our attendees and of CAFII, we really appreciate your taking the time. And to all the attendees, thank you as well for participating in this. And I wish all of you a great rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Bye-bye.